Pam Bondi was no stranger to pressure. After years of fighting intense legal battles, handling some of the most challenging cases in the country, she thought she had seen it all. But that day, something was different. As she walked into Judge Malcolm Rourke's courtroom, known for his sharp tongue and unpredictable rulings, Pam felt the weight of the moment. This was no ordinary case. On the other side, an influential real estate businessman, accused of embezzling public funds for his own projects. The evidence? Solid. The stakes? Very high. This was a case with the potential to shake up entire political structures. Pam was prepared. Documents, witnesses, arguments lined up, but what she didn't expect was the attack coming from the judge himself. She approached the prosecution table. The room was silent, the kind of silence that wasn't just formal, it was a strategy. Judge Rourke didn't even look up. He leafed through the files slowly, as if he had all the time in the world at his disposal. The suspense was calculated. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the air with contempt. "Ms. Bondi, I hope you prepared something of substance. Or shall we go straight to the part where you waste my time?" Muffled laughter came from the back of the courtroom. The defense team was amused. Pam was not. She kept her gaze steady. "Your Honor, I believe the evidence will speak for itself. This case involves the misuse of public funds. My role is to present the facts clearly." The judge leaned back in his chair, feigning boredom. Public funds, of course. Because that has never been the basis for a frivolous lawsuit, has it? More laughter, more taunting. But Pam Bondi wasn't here to play. She was here to win. Before Pam's jaw could snap shut, she kept her cool. In a firm but controlled voice, she replied, "Respectfully, Your Honor, I wouldn't call allegations of serious corruption frivolous." For a brief moment, their gazes met. His eyes were cold and calculating, hers unfazed. But before she could continue, he interrupted her again. "Mrs. Bondi, spare me the lectures. Just get to the point. I don't have all day to entertain any kind of grandiose speech." A murmur ran through the gallery. The courtroom wasn't packed, but those present were alert. Judges could be tough, yes, but this felt personal. Pam took a deep breath, recalibrating. She knew what was happening. The judge wanted to unsettle her. He wanted to control the pace of the hearing, put her on the defensive. But Pam wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. She grabbed a file from the table, opening it firmly. "Your Honor, I would like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. These financial records clearly demonstrate." But Rourke interrupted again. "Do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork, or is this just your way of compensating?" The room changed instantly. The defense attorney gave a smug smile. A few reporters exchanged quick glances, but Pam didn't move. She didn't flinch. She had known all along that men like Judge Rourke thrived on intimidation, and the only way to defeat them was to never let them see you were shaken. Pam paused, long enough to convey a message without having to say a word. Then she closed the file, clapping her hands together. "Your Honor, if you'd prefer to continue making this personal, I can request a break while we discuss any professional matters you have." It was subtle, not aggressive, not disrespectful, but the point was clear. She would not bow down. Rourke's lips curved slightly, perhaps in a sarcastic smile. The silence in the courtroom was palpable. Pam knew she was in the middle of a psychological battle. Judge Rourke wanted to intimidate her, to make her feel small, disarmed. But in truth, he didn't know who he was dealing with. She would never bow down. That was Pam's constant thought as she watched him settle into his chair, as if he had won, as if he already had the upper hand. But Pam knew better. He was trying to invade her territory, to make her doubt herself, which was, at its core, a power play. And whoever controls the narrative controls everything. She knew that. Rourke seemed to think he could intimidate her with jokes disguised as disdain, trying to discredit Pam's every move. But in reality, he was making a big mistake. He was underestimating Pam Bondi. In her experience, women in the courtroom often had to struggle with an invisible disadvantage. The legal world, like many others, still had its prejudices and fallacies. But Pam knew exactly how to navigate them. She wasn't just good at what she did, she was unbeatable. The issue of power was becoming clear to her. His attitude was overflowing with an attempt to demonstrate absolute dominance, as if he were the ultimate authority. But in her opinion, power was never about humiliating another person, but about having control over one's own emotions, over one's own posture. Pam, at that moment, was in complete control. She thought for a second, if he thinks he can unsettle me like that, he's wrong. Pam took another breath, letting the weight of the situation sink in. She had to stay calm. She knew her goal wasn't just to win the case. It was to demonstrate what it truly means to be unstoppable, especially when someone tries to bring you down in such a personal way. She glanced back at Rourke, who still had that wry smile. Pam knew this moment wasn't just about the case. It was about making a point. She wasn't here to be the victim of jokes or attempts at control. She was here to show that no one would ever make her lose her composure. Was it amusement or irritation? It was hard to tell, but one thing was clear. He wasn't done yet. "Oh, I have no worries, Mrs. Bondi," he said with a smile that bordered on disdain. "I just know when I see a weak case." This time, the reaction wasn't just a murmur. A few sighs. Someone whispered something under their breath. That was not the behavior of a judge. Pam felt the tension in the room grow. Glances shifted between her and Rourke like a tennis match. But she would not fall for his provocation. That was exactly what he wanted. She straightened her blazer, straightened some papers, and looked at him steadily. Then, with the calm that only someone who had faced even more tense situations could have, she said, "I suppose we should let the evidence speak for itself." But it was when she spoke that something in Rourke's face changed. It wasn't just arrogance. It wasn't just disdain. There was something more. A flicker of something deeper. Like he had something to lose. It was then that Pam knew. This wasn't just legal theater. Judge Rourke wasn't being combative for fun. He had something to hide. She didn't know what, but she knew he was involved in something much bigger than any corruption charges. And what he didn't know, she was too. Pam Bondi had faced her fair share of tense hearings in her career, but none of those compared to what was happening now. Rourke wasn't just deciding the case. He was playing a game. It was a calculated move, a deliberate attempt to undermine her in front of the entire courtroom. But why? Pam felt the weight of his gaze the whole time. Every word she said was as if he were waiting for the perfect moment to pounce on her. She could see the slight smile curving his lips, the slow tapping of his fingers on the countertop, as if he were daring her to continue. She wouldn't stop. "Your Honor," she said, keeping her tone even. "These documents show a clear discrepancy in the funding allocations the defendant company received. Almost triple the amount approved in the original budget, and none of those funds were recorded in the state's documents." She made a slight bow, pointing to the projection screen where the financial statements were displayed. "Now, if we look here—" But Rourke interrupted again. His voice was heavy with that tone of superiority. "I hate to interrupt your presentation. I really do," he said with a wry smile. "But I think we've seen enough numbers for today." Pam glanced at him again and then back at the screen. He wasn't even trying to hide it now. "Your Honor, with all due respect, those numbers are the basis of the case." "Oh, sure," he scoffed. "And yet, I don't see anything that justifies wasting the court's time on this." There was again the word he'd been using to dismiss everything. Waste of time. He was trying to bury the case before it even got off the ground. Pam noticed a slight movement behind her, the prosecution team exchanging quick glances, feeling the same pressure. Something was wrong. She gripped her pen tighter, turning to the next page of her case file. "Your Honor, I would like to file a motion to dismiss the objection." Silence. She looked at him. "I haven't filed my motion yet, but I can already tell it's not going anywhere." Rourke leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. "Let's be honest, Ms. Bondi. This entire case is built on speculation, creative accounting, and suddenly you're alleging corruption." The defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a navy suit, smirked. He didn't need to say anything. Rourke was doing all the work for him. Pam exhaled slowly, trying to remain calm but feeling the tension building inside her. "Your Honor, are you refusing to hear my motion without knowing its contents?" A pause, a second too long. Then finally he answered, I am refusing to continue this circus act. The courtroom wasn't just tense now. The atmosphere had changed. Eyes darted back and forth. Heads turned. Even the reporters in the back were typing faster. Pam caught the eye of one of the judges, who seemed unsure what to think. The tension in the room was palpable, as if the air had thickened. Pam Bondi, in her dark blazer and unwavering posture, watched Judge Malcolm Rourke's every move with laser-like attention. He was sitting there with that cocky smile, but something in the air was about to change. What he didn't know was that Pam was much more prepared for this than he had imagined. I personally enjoyed watching how Pam's confidence never wavered, even when faced with a judge who was clearly trying to pressure her. In moments like this, the key is to not only remain calm, but also to show that you are in control of the situation, and Pam was doing that masterfully. When Rourke told her to come closer to the bench, he thought he could intimidate her, but she didn't let him. Instead, she took measured steps, approaching him with the firmness of someone who knew what she was doing. When Rourke, in a menacing whisper, said, "I would strongly suggest that you reconsider the direction you are taking here, Miss Bondi," I thought he made a mistake, because Pam's calm and collected response was a definition of unshakable confidence. She showed no fear, and that is one of the things I admire most about great legal figures. Not giving in to a veiled threat is an act of intelligence and strategy. She was not only challenging the judge, but she was showing everyone in the courtroom who was really in charge. By giving her response, "I don't mind that, Judge Rourke," she was putting something much bigger at stake than just legal argument. She was putting the judge's own pride on the line, and she knew that from that moment on, he could no longer simply ignore her. She was a force he would have to respect. This scene made me think about how important it is to not only face challenges, but to face them with clarity and confidence. The way she faced the threat, without being intimidated, is the definition of emotional power in a courtroom. Pam walked back to the table, her movements controlled. She knew there was something more behind Rourke's arrogance, something he was unwilling to show, but that she was beginning to understand. He was hiding something. When Pam began to present the evidence, it was no longer about numbers or contracts. It was about power, control, and revelations. She put the document on the screen, beginning to draw the line between the defendant and the allegations of corruption. And when she put the contract signed by Rourke, I could really feel the tension in the air change. Rourke was no longer the arrogant judge he had been. Now, he was vulnerable. What Pam had done was expose his vulnerability, and that, my friend, is a masterstroke. The room tensed, almost as if everyone in the room was waiting for an explosion. And when she asked, "Would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving the defendant?" I kept thinking, now he's really in trouble. This question wasn't just an accusation. It was a calculated provocation, a strategic chess move, with Pam in control, even as Rourke tried to turn the tables. And sure enough, Rourke tried to invalidate the evidence, saying the document was inadmissible, but again, Pam was undeterred. She met the blow with calm curiosity, asking, "What do you mean? Was it improperly obtained?" Here, personally, I couldn't help but admire how much Pam was in control of the situation. She was in control, and Rourke, though he tried to hold his ground, was clearly losing the psychological battle. He was becoming increasingly vulnerable to the pressure she was applying. This kind of psychological game, where you don't just present facts but challenge the system in a subtle and clever way, is what separates the great lawyers from ordinary ones. Pam was playing at the highest level. With every word Pam spoke, the room leaned closer to her. The fight was no longer about the documents or the numbers. It was about power itself. Rourke was beginning to realize that by trying to crush Pam's case with arrogance, he was leaving himself open to being exposed. And Pam knew it. She knew she had the judge at a vulnerable point, and she was willing to exploit it to the bitter end. Judge Malcolm Rourke was clearly trying to control the situation, but the tension in the air was already palpable. Pam Bondi, with the calm of someone who knows exactly what she is doing, paused, letting her words echo for a moment. The silence in the room was almost palpable. She didn't need to rush. She knew that the impact of her words was beginning to fall on the judge and everyone present. "You do realize that this is a public hearing, correct?" Pam's voice cut through the air like a knife. That the media is here? That every single person in this room just saw you declare crucial financial evidence inadmissible for no reason. The sentence hung in the air. It was a direct provocation, a challenge delivered without a hint of emotion in Pam's voice. Her determination and strategy in this moment were impressive. She knew exactly how to deflect the pressure Rourke was trying to exert on her. He knew that this public accusation could not be ignored. My personal opinion here is that Pam Bondi is indeed a master of courtroom psychology. She was manipulating the dynamics to her advantage brilliantly. She was not only making a case, but putting the judge, the defendant, and even the audience in an uncomfortable position. She knew that Rourke could not retaliate without further exposing his own flaw, and the way she made the entire courtroom look at him as he tried to justify himself was pure psychological strategy. And then the change was instantaneous. The tension in the room turned into an uncomfortable silence, a moment of collective consternation that settled over every person there, without exception. Pam calmly took something out of her briefcase, a small tape recorder. She placed it on the table and pressed the play button. And that was when everything changed. The low, hoarse sound that filled the courtroom was nothing short of explosive. "Take care of this. I don't care how. Make sure she can't get her hands on those accounting records." The recording continued with frightening clarity, revealing the threatening tone, the attempted sabotage, the judge's own voice in collusion with the interests of a corrupt corporation. The room was paralyzed. There were no murmurs. There was no breathing. All that was left was an overwhelming silence. The audience itself had realized what was happening there. The tape recorder had spoken, and Judge Malcolm Rourke, until then an imposing figure, now stood naked before the court. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. No defense. Nothing. I don't know about you, but I felt a rush of emotion watching this moment. Pam's courage in exposing the recording without hesitation was proof that when you are faced with the truth, there is no fear that can stop you. She knew she had just turned the tables, and it was fascinating to see how the judge himself, the authority figure in the courtroom, was now being reduced to a man without words, with no way out. The immediate effect was clear. The defendant's defense attorney, who had been a passive spectator until then, finally lost control. His face, previously marked by calm arrogance, now transformed. The expression of fear was clear. He was no longer confident. The roles were being reversed before everyone's eyes. The defendant, the billionaire developer, was visibly uncomfortable. He knew that the empire built on secret deals and political favors was beginning to crumble. Personally, this was one of the most powerful moments in this entire story. Exposing Judge Rourke through this recording was a risky move, but it was undoubtedly Pam's final card. By putting the recording on the table, she not only exposed the corruption, but she destroyed any chance Rourke had of saving himself or manipulating the hearing. I found myself thinking, if this moment isn't proof that the truth always comes out, I don't know what is. The courtroom was completely silent, almost suffocating. All eyes were fixed on the recorder on the table, while Pam Bondi remained calm, her gaze never wavering. She didn't need to say anything else. The recording spoke for itself. Judge Malcolm Rourke's voice, which had previously seemed unshakable, was now on tape, and that was enough to turn the tide. The defense attorney finally made a move, a quick glance at his client, the developer, who was now visibly shaken. The confident smile he had been wearing until then disappeared, replaced by a look of concern. Judge Rourke, still motionless, seemed to be trying to control the situation, but it was clear that he was at the bottom of a hole of his own making. He clenched his fingers on the table, his face tense, his eyes fixed on the recorder. But there was no denying the truth of what had just been revealed. Pam took her time to act. She knew that the impact of the recording had already spread throughout the room, and she didn't need to do anything else for now. She simply leaned back in her chair, her eyes still fixed on the judge, waiting for his answer. Rourke finally broke the silence. That is not admissible," he murmured, his voice no longer as confident as before. Pam stared at him without blinking. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this has already been heard by everyone here. Now, it's your word against the truth." Judge Rourke seemed to struggle with the words. trying to find a way out. I'll deliberate on this in private, he said finally, his voice shaking. But Pam knew the battle was already won. The evidence was there in public, and nothing could erase what had been said. The court had already seen what it needed to see. She looked around, taking in the expressions of the people in the room. The impact of the recording had not gone unnoticed. The gaze of the juror in her 50s, who had previously been focused on proceedings, was now filled with uncertainty. Their brows furrowed, their eyes wide. They were all processing what had just happened. The defense attorney glanced quickly at the judge, apparently searching for some way to intervene, but he knew he could do nothing. The room was against him. The tables had turned, and the power was now in Pam Bondi's hands. The judge, still recovering, called a brief recess. "We're going to adjourn for 15 minutes, he said, his voice now lowered, barely audible. Pam didn't move from her chair. She knew time was on her side. She had played her card, and now all that was left was to wait. The man looked pale. Judge Malcolm Rourke cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Ms. Bondi, I don't know where you got that recording, but that's not the issue that should be being raised." Pam didn't hesitate, but interrupted, her voice firm and unwavering. "Your Honor, the real question is, who were you talking to?" The words fell heavily on the room. Rourke's fingers curled into fists in what seemed like a reflex of anger. "This is absurd," he snapped, his tone becoming more aggressive. "This hearing is turning into chaos because of your attempts at grandiosity." "Chaos," Pam repeated, her voice light, almost amused. "I would say this is clarity. Finally, we now have transparency in this courtroom." The tension in the room grew. Pam gave him time to sit still, letting him feel uncomfortable before she continued. Then she picked up another document and slid it across the table. "Your Honor, this is a transcript of a wiretap lawfully obtained during our investigation." Pam tapped her finger on the top of the page. "This corroborates everything you just heard on the recording." Judge Rourke stared at the document, but didn't touch it. His chest rose and fell with his breath, more heavily now, as if he were preparing for something. Pam turned slightly to the bailiff beside her. "Officer Reynolds, would you read the highlighted section aloud?" The officer hesitated, picked up the transcript, and began to read, his voice steady, but the words weighed like lead over the courtroom. "We'll take care of her. Bondi doesn't have anything solid yet, but if she does, I'll make sure it never sees the courtroom." The air in the room seemed to freeze. Pam clasped her hands in front of her face, motionless. "I'd like to submit this as evidence." Judge Rourke's gaze flicked toward the exit. It was a subtle movement, but enough for everyone to notice. For the first time, he was thinking about something other than his arrogance. He was thinking about escaping, but it was too late for that. Motion denied. He snapped, his voice trying to maintain an authority that was already fading. Pam raised an eyebrow, almost disinterested. "Sorry, but I wasn't asking for your permission." And then she did what she'd been planning to do all along. She turned softly toward the back of the room, giving the smallest, most subtle of nods. The door opened. Footsteps echoed across the polished floor. "You're under arrest," a firm, authoritative voice announced. A gasp of surprise filled the room. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Cameras snapped, and even the jury, struggling to remain impartial, couldn't hide their shock. Judge Rourke didn't move. He stood there motionless, his eyes fixed on a spot on his bench, as if he could make everything disappear if he just didn't move. But reality had already caught up with him. Pam sat in her chair, unmoving, as two uniformed officers approached Rourke. One reached into his pocket. The other removed his handcuffs. "This is absurd," Rourke muttered, but the fight was already gone from his voice. He was defeated. The officers didn't flinch. "You have the right to remain silent." And for the first time in his career, Judge Malcolm Rourke was indeed silent. The sound of metal snapping shut was deafening. The handcuffs snapped shut around Rourke's wrists, sealing his fate in front of everyone, including the people he had ruled for so long. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Disbelief hung in the air like static electricity. The reporters couldn't write fast enough. Hands flew to their notebooks, trying to capture this historic moment. The jury, with their shocked expressions, couldn't hide their shock. But Pam didn't move. She remained calm and serious. This wasn't about bragging. She knew this moment was just the beginning. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Judge Malcolm Rourke finally found his voice. "You can't do this." The words came out low, almost a whisper, as if he didn't believe them himself. The officer holding his arm didn't budge. "Sir, you are being arrested for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power. You will be given the opportunity to speak with an attorney." Rourke strained against the handcuffs, his face turning red. "This is an outrage. I am the law in this court." Pam Bondi finally stood, straightening her blazer. "No more," she said. Rourke's head turned toward her. For the first time, the arrogance had been replaced by something different, something closer to fear. The officers pulled him to his feet, but he resisted. "This is politics. Pam shook her head. "This is accountability." The room fell into a deathly silence. A lifetime of unchecked power, destroyed in a single moment. Rourke's face contorted, his jaw clenching as he stared out at the gallery. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for an ally, someone to stand up and declare this a mistake. But no one moved, because it wasn't a mistake. A few feet away, the defense attorney was pale as a sheet. The developer, the man who thought his power could protect him, wasn't much better. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, his breathing shallow. Pam let her eyes rest on him for a moment before returning her attention to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm, measured, "if you have anything to say, I suggest you save it for your committal hearing." Rourke's mouth opened, then closed again, because there was nothing more to say. The officers began to lead him toward the side exit, but before they reached the door, the developer finally found his voice. Wait. His chair squeaked against the floor as he stood, his eyes darting from Rourke to Bondi, trying to figure out what was happening. "This is getting out of hand. We can work it out. We can find a middle ground." Pam raised an eyebrow, her tone a little more cynical. "Find a middle ground?" The man swallowed, visibly disintegrating. I mean, there's no need for this whole public spectacle. Let's be reasonable." Pam studied him for a moment, then stepped forward. "You seem nervous, Mr. Lawson." His mouth opened, but no words came out. She tilted her head, her gaze searching. "I wonder why." He shook his head, forcing out a nervous laugh. "Nervous? No, that's insane. You don't seriously believe Rourke is guilty, do you?" Pam let the question hang in the air, unanswered. Silence filled the room. "Do you?" The silence was heavy. The officers continued to move, ushering Rourke toward the door. When it finally closed behind them, the room grew even quieter. The weight of the moment settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a dismantling of a system that had been protected for far too long. And Pam Bondi wasn't done yet. She looked at the jury at the empty judge's bench, and then at the defense table. "I believe we still have a trial to finish," she said, her voice firm. "But after what happened today, everyone in this room knows this is just the beginning." The room felt different now, lighter, as if the weight of years of corruption had been instantly lifted. Rourke was out, led away in handcuffs, and the shock still hung in the air like the last note of a symphony. Pam Bondi sat back down, rearranging the papers on her desk. The trial wasn't over. Not yet. But the biggest obstacle had just been removed. She turned her attention to the defense table. Developer Charles Lawson was uncomfortably silent. His usual arrogance had been replaced by something colder, more calculating. He was still trying to assess the damage, to gauge how much of his safety net had been destroyed. Pam could see the gears turning in his head. Without Rourke on the stand, his defense team would have to argue on the merits of the case, and they had none. She leaned forward a little. "Mr. Lawson," she said softly, "would you like to continue with today's proceedings, or would you prefer to discuss a negotiation?" His jaw clenched. "This is a witch hunt." Pam smiled, slightly. "No, Mr. Lawson, this is justice." He laughed humorlessly, shaking his head. "Do you think a corrupt judge changes anything?" Do you think that means you win? Pam didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch, allowing the gravity of the moment to sink in. I think it means the system still works, she said finally, that no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, the truth will always catch up with them. Lawson exhaled sharply, but she had nothing else to say. The judge's bench remained empty, but it didn't matter. The case was no longer in Rourke's hands. The prosecution team exchanged glances, and one of Pam's colleagues leaned toward her. Maybe it's time to seek a plea deal. Pam considered this for a moment. She could feel the change in the air, how different the room was. The jury was attentive, watching, waiting. They had witnessed something they would never forget. But she wasn't about to let it end with a whisper. She stood. "Your Honor," she began, then stopped, correcting herself for the judge who would take the case. "I would like to make a formal request to proceed with more evidence. Given today's situation, it's clear that we need a full investigation into how far this corruption goes." A murmur went around the room. Judge Rourke was only part of the problem. Pam continued. "If my team was able to uncover this, it means there are more names, more people who thought they were untouchable." She turned to Lawson. "So, let me ask you again, Mr. Lawson, do you want to talk?" Lawson sat rigidly, his fingers tapping the table. He was weighing his options. Finally, he exhaled. "If I talk, I want protection." Pam nodded slowly. "Then I'd better start talking." The courtroom was not the same as it had been an hour ago. The balance of power had shifted. The walls that protected the powerful began to crack, and Pam Bondi had just sent a message to everyone watching. No one is above the law. As the bailiff called for order, the courtroom prepared to move on, reporters in the back of the room scurrying to file their stories. This wasn't just another case. It was history, and this was just the beginning. The courtroom, once filled with tension and corruption, now breathed justice. Pam Bondi, with courage and strategy, had brought down the corrupt judge Malcolm Rourke and revealed the truth that many had wanted to hide. The scales of justice had tipped in the right direction, and the war on impunity had begun. Corruption was being dismantled piece by piece, and with each step, Pam was sending a clear message. No one is above the law. The trial continued, but the power of the shadows was already beginning to dissipate. The truth was finally being exposed.